invitation, the invitation of Interpret Europe. It's a great honour to be here. As Helena said, I'm an environmental psychologist and have been for many years doing research on the environment, all aspects of the environment, architecture, planning, transport, waste, and so on and so forth. But two areas have dominated my work. One has been climate change, which I've been working on, perhaps you'll find surprisingly, for the last 30 years. That's how long climate change has been an issue, but not necessarily in public awareness, but also in the area of heritage interpretation, which I've been working on rather longer than that. Much of this work is focused on how and what do visitors learn at heritage sites and museums, what are the public's perceptions, attitudes, and actions in respect of climate change, and what are the most effective ways of bringing about change. And so it seems to me there's an opportunity here for me to bring those two areas actually together. I'm sure you are familiar with this. Freeman Tilden wrote his influential book, Interpreting Our Heritage, some 70 years ago. And there's one sentence which is always quoted: through interpretation, understanding, through understanding, appreciation, through appreciation, protection. It continues to provide a justification for many of the communication strategies in interpretation. Moreover, the underlying psychological model of persuasion and behaviour change has been regarded as the taken-for-granted approach in communication strategies by governments who wish to change public attitudes and behaviours in respect of health, environmental, dietary, and many other issues. This is basically the information deficits model. Climate science, and indeed you could argue Freeman Tilden, has revealed that we have a serious problem, and all we must do is to lay out the evidence and the world will understand and respond appropriately. Show and tell people the natural environment, they will appreciate it and then want to protect it. Now, while this seems like an obvious and plausible psychological model of communication effectiveness, most research has shown time and time again that it's unjustifiable and unsupportable. Firstly, attitudes. Firstly, information and interpretation doesn't necessarily increase people's understanding. Simply telling someone about a problem, they may not necessarily understand it anyway. And just simply giving people information is not the same as understanding. Understanding doesn't necessarily lead to attitude change. One only has to look at the advice given on smoking, excessive alcohol, drugs, saturated fats, diet and obesity, wearing seat belts, cycling helmets, so many issues which are directly related to people's own health and safety, things you might have thought they had a very direct and personal interest in, people still don't change. Attitudes comprise three elements. There's a cognitive element, there's an affective or emotional element, and there's a behavioural element. And unless you address all three elements, you're less likely to bring about change. And that was the basis of the work I did many years ago on hot interpretation. A lot of work on interpretation of war and conflict did not have any kind of affective dimension to it. So you would leave a battlefield site and feel completely unmoved. And then last of all, attitude change doesn't necessarily lead to behaviour change. If I was to ask you, how many of you have a car? And how many of you, okay, great, there's plenty of you have a car. Okay, how many of you are concerned about climate change? better? That doesn't sound...
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. I tend to wander around a bit. And I guess most of you are concerned about climate change. But if I was to say to you, who's going to give up your car in the next 6 months? Can you put your hand up? Oh, some brave people there. You're cheating. One could ask the same question in relation to meat. How many people are prepared to give up meat in the next 3 months? Slightly more. It's not my purpose to make you feel guilty. It's simply to demonstrate that while Tilden's formula and indeed government climate change campaigns are appealing, it's not so straightforward in practice. People don't make up their mind just on the basis of evidence. There are all sorts of competing influences, their ideological outlook, their identity, the tribes they belong to, which all come with particular mindsets, fears and goals. In some cases, it's often better to change the behaviour first by forcing behaviour change, and the attitudes will follow. But of course, this is not very popular with governments. I'm sure you can imagine why. Now, while attitudes and values are seen by psychologists as residing within the head, we must remember they've got there somehow. Changing the conditions which encourage and drive our behaviours may be a more effective strategy. We need to tackle the societal structures and processes that promote and reinforce the demands, desires, values, images, identities and inequalities that influence and determine our lifestyle choices and how we can and use the environment. The second issue I want to raise focuses on the language we use, both words and images, to talk about these major global and critical issues. Where is the global? Is it the Antarctic, where glaciers are melting fast? Or is it Asia and Africa, where floods, storms, droughts are increasing? Or is it just somewhere else, a long way away from us? Or is it just code for the global south? Or is every place global and local? If this is the case, it makes little sense to differentiate between a relatively safe local and a threatened global environment. Language structures, it frames, it provides us with options and possibilities for action, and closes off other options. Global warming and global environmental change encourage people to feel powerless, because how can they influence these global processes? People are more likely to feel responsible and have control over their environment and their own environmentally damaging actions when they are local. People not only feel powerless when global environmental problems are discussed, but they think that national and international agencies should be the ones responsible for taking action. And I think this is known as true for the way we think of and talk about threats to the heritage. Now, there's much evidence to suggest that there is this sense of powerlessness and alienation, and this influences feelings of responsibility. This is some research I did in the late 1990s, looking at people's concern about global environmental problems and where they were. And you can see from here, this work was done in Australia, Slovakia, and in the UK. And serious global environmental problems were always at the global level. And that was really interpreted as a long way from them. It was not seen at the local level. The local level, the scores on the left are much lower. So the further away from you, the environmental problems got worse. But you could see also from there that responsibility declined. So people felt responsible at the local level, where there are no problems, but they had little responsibility for what they called the global level. Repeated this work, or a variation on this work, some 10 years later, where we introduced the concept of time, and there was still something of the same effect. Concern of the environment locally was getting a bit higher, but it was still in the future. I haven't done this work recently, and I wonder what the graph would look like now. I suspect it was something like this. It's something we'll spend some time talking about. We've all experienced here in Europe serious changes to our climate over the last 10 years. Floods in Britain, Germany, Austria, Slovenia, drought in Spain. One could list all sorts of these problems, which are now irrefutably being put down to climate change. So there is a much heightened awareness now that it's at the local level. What about responsibility? That I'm not sure. Maybe people still feel that they have little responsibility at the global level. I don't know. It's purely speculative. Okay. Let's be a little bit more positive. So what are the most effective means of learning and bringing about change into mindsets? I want to focus on visiting heritage sites and museums as a social experience. Now, a little bit of theory. Now, there's one theory of learning that asserts that as we explore the environment, our pre-existing knowledge is confronted with new information and perspectives. And when we're confronted with this new knowledge, new perspectives, we can either reject it, we can accept it, or we can somehow assimilate and accommodate it. This is how we learn. Now, some social psychologists have argued that this process doesn't simply go on in the head. It's a social process. People are constantly monitoring the thoughts and actions of others and moderating their own thoughts and behaviours. In other words, when we interact with others, we are influenced by the way they see the world. It's an influence we can accept, reject, or assimilate in some way. In other words, while learning is the resolution of cognitive conflicts within individuals, it's also a product of the coordination and resolution of conflicts between individuals, i.e. when they interact with each other. Now, we've carried out research on learning about scientific concepts and the historic past using this approach. And I'm going to summarise the study we did in the Science Museum that focused on family groups interacting naturally in a real museum setting rather than in an experimental situation. We were interested in whether we could find evidence that this socio-cognitive conflict occurs between adults and children when they look at exhibits in a museum, especially as children and adults will be operating at different cognitive levels. Now, in these studies, learning performance was contrasted at 3 different types of exhibit. The first was a static, passive display, sort of thing we're all very familiar. The second was an exhibit that required visitors to interact physically with it. And the third exhibit required social interaction. we found 4 things which I think you'll find really interesting. The social interactive exhibit encouraged more exhibit-related discussion than the static or the physically interactive exhibit. The social interactive exhibit, the quality of the social interaction was qualitatively different to the other interactive media. That is, the content of the discussion was more sophisticated and informed. Visitors demonstrated a better understanding of the concept of gear wheels. That was the focus of the exhibit, at the social interactive exhibit, but only when they were talking to each other. And then, for me, most interestingly, learning was not one way. You might assume that it was the children learned more than the adults. But what we found was adults learned from children as a result of talking and discussing with them the content of the exhibits. The children's questions and comments made them think more. I think these results are important because they suggest that designing interpretation that encourages social interaction may be an important way of ensuring our interpretation is effective and interesting. Professor Chris Rapley, who's the former director of the Science Museum, wrote in 2018, some 20 years after we did this research, he said, yes, the key is starting where people are, in their own minds and bodies, and engaging on their terms. It's also about connections between people. One of the great things at the Science Museum is that you get a lot of intergenerational discussion between adults and children, whether it's within families or school groups. Now I'm going to return to this a little later. For the last few years, I've worked as a volunteer at a major garden in the UK run by the Royal Horticultural Society. RHS Wisley is situated about 40 kilometres southwest of London. It covers just under 100 hectares. It's the second most visited paid entry garden in the United Kingdom and attracts 1.2 million visitors a year. So to put that into some kind of interpretive context, that's half the size of Slovenia. The RHS is the UK's foremost gardening advice provider, and I work with a small but hugely talented interpretation team. Just 4 weeks ago, an event called Plants Before Time opened. This event sought to show visitors that through scientific evidence, one can trace the origins of everyday houseplants to fossilised remains of the earliest known plant forms on the planet. The event took people on a journey of some 400 million years. Visitors walked through the glass house. Visitors walk through the glass house, which comprises temperate, tropical and arid environments. In the glass house, the story of these prehistoric plants is told to the occasional sound of birdsong, dinosaurs walking and swirling mist. Unfortunately, I can't play the sound here today. It's very frightening. This seeks to be an immersive experience. Of course, it's backed up by interpretation, which encourages visitors to look and see, to listen and hear, to imagine, to step back in time. We produced interpretive panels which try to give visitors basic information about key historic periods life on Earth at that time and what plants were growing, the descendants of which are now growing in our glass house and which you can grow yourself. Now it's well known that when many people visit heritage sites and go through exhibitions, they do not read most of the provided material. We undertook a small amount of evaluation in which we tracked visitors through the exhibition, we conducted interviews, we held a focus group, and we received spontaneous comments from the public. When we tracked people walking around, we found, as always, with exhibitions, people may read the interpretation, but if they do, they only read little bits of it. We tracked a small sample of visitors around the exhibition and we found that the average amount of time people spent in the exhibition was about 27 minutes, and it ranged from 10 to 50 minutes. The average amount of time looking at the interpretive panels was 7 minutes. Some spent a considerable amount of time in the exhibition, but a relatively small amount of time looking at the provided interpretation. Learning obviously comes from their experience and social engagement as much as the provided interpretation. Experiencing the heritage involves the whole person, the psychological, the physical, the social, and the spiritual and social. And the interpretation should build on that. People, of course, were learning from the environment itself. Their senses were being employed to read and feel the environment. They were not just looking, but they were seeing. They were not just listening, hearing. They were sensing changes in the microclimate, in the colours of the plants in different environmental conditions. And what their interpretation rightly sought to do was much more than inform, but achieve what Freeman Tilden suggested should be its purpose: to encourage, to inspire, to provoke, to reveal, to encourage curiosity and imagination. Interpretation which facilitates different kinds of experiences, which challenges their ways of seeing, their mindsets, may be the most effective way of enabling change. Do we give visitors in space the time they need to think about and immerse themselves in heritage? I'm sure many of you have heard of forest bathing, known in Japanese as shirin-yaka. It's immersing yourself in a place and consciously connecting with what's around you. I do heritage bathing. I like to sit quietly and immerse myself in a heritage setting for an experiential engagement, contemplation, meditation about time. Who was walking these stones 500 years ago? What was their lifestyle? What were their fears and joys? What were the boundaries, their boundaries of their understanding compared with us today? Indeed, what was their experience of this very place? Should we be encouraging heritage bathing where people can immerse themselves in time, place and space and contemplate past, present and future, the near and the far, the global north and the global south? And of course, I did what I know that yesterday in Zegnica with Helena and the group, she began by asking us all to just stand still for a moment and take in the scene. Listen, look. And then she asked us, okay, what word comes to mind when you do this? And I think the first word that came out was sublime. And then she asked the question, well, how do you think this environment has changed over the years and how does it change? And then I have to say that all the professional interpreters then looked rather horrified they were being asked a question. But then answers started to flow. I want to finish discussing another idea for bringing about change and changing mindsets in addressing the societal problems we face. The principle and application is not new, but it may be something which is not thought about so much as an output of heritage interpretation. And I call it giving interpretation away. The first question I would ask is, what is the legacy of heritage, of a heritage experience? I sometimes worry that we're creating a dependency relationship with visitors. In other words, visitors expect and need to have the heritage site interpreted for them if they're to get the most out of their visit. Of course, to a degree, this is true. But what is the legacy of their visit? What is the lasting gift that we're giving them from their visit? Apart from the guidebook, the branded box of biscuits, and the digital photographs that they have taken on their phones, but will probably never look at again. Are we equipping visitors with something valuable to take away with them that they can use the next time they visit a heritage site, including those which exist in the everyday world, away from labelled heritage sites? Typically, educational activities seek to equip people with skills so that the next time they come across a similar situation, they have the competencies to start to decode, to make sense, interpret the situation with which they're faced. Should we be doing this, or do we think we're doing this in interpretation? It's in the nature of most people to try and make sense of the world they're encountering. And there are many instances where they will need, of course, for people like interpreters to provide orientation, to help them understand the site in its past, to decode the science, to strip away the jargon, to translate the concepts and ideas into a language using images and words that are meaningful to a lay audience. But is there an opportunity to provide visitors with the mindset and a guiding hand from the interpreter for the skills of navigating, understanding and drawing out the meaning and significance of the world around them? After all, we call this practice interpretation. We must surely recognise that there are multiple interpretations of all situations and settings. We think of interpreters as providing answers for heritage visitors. I think interpreters should also see one of their strengths, as Helena did clearly yesterday, as encouraging and showing visitors how to ask questions so as to have a more personal and more meaningful engagement with the heritage. It's through asking questions, as I demonstrated earlier on, that visitors will start not only to look, but also see, not only listen, but discuss. The third element of giving interpretation away is community involvement. For example, I think we can involve local communities to contribute to the interpretation of the heritage. This is happening in many places already, of course. In the Plants Before Time exhibition I spoke about just now, the communities team at Uzzell met with a local community group called Enterprise 19, which comprises young adults with disabilities and are involved in creating projects. The Uzzell team arranged for the group to visit the exhibition, view the prehistoric plants such as the tree ferns, the conifers, the palms, and then they created a set of images of the relevant plant species so the young adults could take inspiration for their drawings. And these adults then used this experience to interpret the prehistoric plants. and their contribution and perspective made an invaluable addition to the exhibition. The title of my paper refers to the existential crises we face. There are other existential crises other than climate and nature. And I'm thinking, for example, of the millions of people who migrate, many of whom cross borders as refugees, which we're all well aware of at the moment. There is nothing more existential than the question, who am I? Do I belong in this place? I've been recently working with colleagues in Australia, examining the impact of museums which position the First World War military engagement in Gallipoli in Turkey, commonly known as the Anzac story, as central to the formation of Australian identity. The Anzac identity allegedly comprises 15 values and speaks to what it means to be Australian. We conducted in-depth interviews with 93 adult first, second and third generation Australian visitors to the Australian War Memorial, which is the name for the Australian War Museum, National War Museum in Canberra. Now, of those 92 or 93, whatever it was, 37 of whom had recent migrant backgrounds from some 20 countries of origin. The dominant group positively aligned themselves with the war heritage, national identity, authorised heritage discourse. We use Lorraine James Smith's theory of this, which basically argues that the authorised heritage discourse focuses on all that's good and important about the past. It tries to promote a consensus view of history by state-sanctioned cultural institutions and elites, and it excludes the historical, cultural and social experiences of a range of groups. So it excludes some groups that don't fall into that category. Well, the dominant group positively align themselves with this. For this group, national identity is reinforced by those qualities typically described as being forged out of the Anzac experience. The second group questioned the mythological status of the Anzac legacy, yet embraced it as important as a unifying force for national identity. Those resisting the war heritage, national identity, AHD, challenged the often assumed links between history, heritage and identity. They did not feel that to be Australian, you had to both have these values and deny the values of your own cultural background. We can't assume that visitors will want to align themselves with the values being promoted by heritage sites, not because they don't respect those values, but they have their own values, which are no less valid and rooted in their heritage. The Science Museum's 2009 exhibition, Prove It, sought to provide the public with evidence for man-made climate change. It asked visitors to send a message of support to the UK negotiating team at COP15 in Copenhagen. You remember the one, the very unsuccessful one? They all are really. The poll had surprising results. Large numbers of visitors voted that they did not give their support to the UK negotiating team. People don't want to be told what to think. They want a framework from which they can begin to make sense of things. They want to be helped in thinking for themselves, whether it's about climate change and how we tackle it, or how we identify with our own country. interpreters are in a position to interpret the existential problems we face. But if we want, as the UNESCO report on the role of visitor centres in UNESCO designated sites suggests, co-creators taking ownership and activating critical and self-critical reflection on different narratives, then we need ground-up, creative, participative processes whereby interpretation techniques are passed on to and used by communities to bring about change at the local, global level and then to act. I think this picks up on two issues I discussed earlier. Communication should be empowering and an incentive to action. And learning strategies should reflect the influential social ways which people learn. And an important function of interpretation is, as Tilden suggests, to inspire, to provoke, to engage. And this can lead to positive, hopeful, creative solutions. I want to just finish now with some words from Naomi Klein. If we want to change mindsets, we need to provide a positive narrative that makes sense to people, with which they can identify and own, contribute to, and then act. Heritage and heritage interpretation, I think, has a crucial part to play in that vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor David Uzzell. Are there any questions in the public? Any reflection?
I'm very happy to talk to people afterwards. Much easier.
It always takes some time.
When I understand you right, it is important to raise questions in people's heads rather than giving them a declarative thesis. So you would suggest to rethink the paradigm of thematic interpretation. Do you?
I want to suggest
To rethink the concept of thematic interpretation. So what the theme is. Yeah.
So Sandhan's concept that every interpretation should be aligned to one central idea which is expressed as a declarative thesis and not as a question.
Okay. I think that interpreters have in their mind a set of answers to their question. They answer the question they think should be asked. And I think it's very important that visitors may have different questions. How often do we ask ourselves, for example, what do the visitors want to know? What does the visitor need to know, rather than what do I want to tell the visitor? Of course, it's very important that if one's got a fragile or important heritage site, you want to get that story across. It's part of looking after it. Don't deny that for a moment. But I think what lies behind a lot of what I was saying is there's got to be some space. We mustn't think of this as processing people. They arrive on the coach and we process them from the moment they arrive to the moment they leave. We've got to give them some space to think about issues themselves and to take away questions. I don't deny that having a themed approach is important. I mean, I've done it myself. But I think within that, one can still create some space. And I think it's also about simply, like Helena did yesterday, just asking people some questions to think about, so that the next time they go to a heritage site, they go armed with those questions. So I think the way I always think about this is we had a sculpture exhibition at Uzzell at the Gardens several years ago, and this all happened very, very quickly, and it was really not going to be possible for us to provide much interpretation. But I thought, I was interested in that as a problem though. How does one interpret sculpture? Tremendously difficult, like interpreting art is anyway. And I looked all around the world, as it were, by means of Google, at what was being done in other sculpture parks. How are they interpreting sculpture in those places? And didn't get a great deal of help. There was one or two places for doing some interesting things. But what came across is it's about asking people just to look. Giving them questions like, is this sit in the right place? If you look at this piece of sculpture from a different angle, under different light conditions. And I comprised a set of about 25 different questions which I thought could be given to visitors as a way of them trying to look at these sculptures in different ways. There's no right answer. There isn't a meaning of a piece of sculpture, like there isn't a meaning for most things in life. It has multiple meanings. But I just wanted them, instead of feeling maybe slightly alienated and powerless and not having anything to grab onto, this will be a way of getting them to start to look at these works and get something else of experience. And then hopefully the next time they went to a similar place, they would remember that as part of the legacy. You're giving away the skills of interpretation. And I think that's a really valuable thing to do.
Thank you so much. Any other? Oh, we've got. Come to you.
David, I'd like to congratulate you on what you said. We've known each other for about 40 odd years or something. That's the most useful things you've ever said to me. I mean that complimentary. You also were listening to a conversation I was having with some people last night. I said interpreters, and particularly guides, should stop telling us what they know and ask us what we find out. So I congratulate you on that line as well. And we were also talking about the democratization of heritage, that heritage is not big houses and castles and all the rest of its people. And I wonder if you would be prepared to give a lecture at some stage on what I would call the dispelling the myths of heritage interpretation, which you've begun to do today. And I go back to Don Aldrich, who was my mentor in 1969 on the first course in heritage interpretation in the United Kingdom. And he was the leader then, although he fell out with the interpretive community, and I suspect for some of the reasons that you're talking about today, but he was way ahead of us. He wrote a wonderful cartoon book called The Great Ship Interpretation was Founded on the Rocks, or something similar, I can't remember that. But I think what you're saying could be the beginnings of a rethinking of what we do. People come to many sites already terribly well informed because they've got the world's encyclopedia in their hands, you were relating to yourself. So take on from what you said today You're the psychologist, you're the academic, you're the clever man, I'm just a man in the street. But what you said resonates so much with me, and I think with many other people. So thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mike. I'd just like to say I think there are very few people who came into contact with Donald who weren't heavily influenced by him.
I just have a short question. Hi, everybody. So, Yanja from Slovenia. You were talking about how people don't want to be told what to think, but to create their own frames of mind and so on. I'm sorry if I missed that in your lecture, but how did they express this, or how was this collected that these are actually the wishes of people, or is this just our wishful thinking that they want to think?
Okay, so in the project,
Yes.
how did you find out what people want to find out about heritage, or was it this just management's vision? Which project?
Which one?
In general. Okay, so how do we know what people want? Do we collect their opinions in advance, or is this just our presumption what they want to know?
Yes, I think it's really important to conduct evaluation, both what's called formative evaluation and summative evaluation. Talking to people beforehand, finding out what their views are. As Chris Rapley was saying, you need to start where people are at. And you can't do that unless you actually ask them in the first place to find out how do they see this particular issue, because it's going to make much more sense for them if you can start from where they are, and if they have a very peculiar view of something, you can at least start to change that. So yes, I think it's really important. You do research on the subject of the interpretation, but you also, I think, have to do, or well advised to do research on your audience too. So there's not just one audience. I mean, working at the gardens at Uzzell, I'm very aware of that. We have very expert horticulturists, gardeners come along, and then we have people that, like me, that don't know one end of a weed from another, and we're trying to cater for that wide span of knowledge and trying to get everyone interested. And that's not easy.
But just the time for just only one more question or a comment. Well, will you share this comment together?
Okay, thank you. If I got Wiley right, Yanja right, and I think this is a rightful remark, the point is that we often predict that people want to unfold themselves, be creative, do these things, but as a matter of fact, in many situations, if you look for guided books, for example, people expect to be told something. And we need to be aware of that. I absolutely follow all you said. And we need to ask people questions. We need to activate them, but we need to be aware that there is a barrier we need to overcome first. Because it's often if we say we want to fulfill the expectations of people, and if you're really honest, the expectation of many visitors coming from a cruise ship or whatever is just to be told something and then move on. And so we need to start from this point, and I think this is a very important remark.
Just one more question by Everest.
Yeah, my question is why, if we from 50s we have local information and we know from the psychology communication that that interpretation tools, skills are really relevant to create an effect of the public in general. Why is it so rare to see interpretation in scenes, guides, exhibitions, or national parks? This is a kind of contradiction between the relevant impact that we create from the public and when we see in the reality there is not so much interpretation. Thank you very much. Yeah, the question is where do you see is the focus between the knowledge that we have in terms of how much interpretation is affected the people in terms of create meanings, provoke thinking about realities, etc., and how much all of these tools are implemented on the reality, can be scenes, exhibitions, natural parks, etc.
So the difference between the
This lack of.
implementation.
Yeah, where don't we see it? Where don't we see it?
Yeah, so the question was why don't we see the results
Use the microphone.
on ground, whereas there is so much knowledge, tools out there. If we can, why is this discrepancy between the body of knowledge and reality, like a huge? I need to add that if you're speaking here from the perspective of the country
Right.
in UK, the situation is
Right. Okay. I mean, as I understand the question, I mean, the research that comes out is usually sort of sponsored, paid for by the providers of the interpretation. I mean, sometimes that gets made public, sometimes not. Sometimes it will appear in journals, sometimes not. I have another slide up here, which basically says, you know, if anyone's interested in some of the studies that I've been talking about this morning, by all means do write to me and I will send you the papers. It's quite a difficult question for me to answer, I think, here now. I'm not quite sure I fully understand it.
Yeah, we probably need to add that David is coming from UK, where the tradition of interpretation has longer, whereas in continental Europe isn't very. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. David Uzzell. I think. Chatting up with you, but we need to move on with the program. Please, Bettina and Zrinka, join us with announcements, practicalities for the day.
Okay, so as we're already rather late and we just decided to cut the coffee break a little, yes, the program, there were so many changes, last minute changes, and I think we never had so many broken arms and legs that made people not coming. But I think in the end it's a really nice and inspiring program. I will now not introduce any strands. We tried to put them in strands, but in the end it was really difficult. We just, with all the cancellations, we just had to fill gaps. So I think you will find your way. Outside there is a board with workshops, papers, and because most of the workshop leaders, they wanted to have only a certain number because otherwise you could not do it. Please sign into these papers out there.